Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Norse. In 1643, an Icelandic farmer living in the rural western fjords handed a manuscript to Bishop Brynjolfur Sveinsson of Skalholt. The vellum was old. Later paleographic analysis would date the pages to the late 13th century, though the oral and written traditions they recorded were substantially older. The bishop recognized what he was holding, a collection of poems that Christian Europe had not seen in written form before, perhaps had never seen at all. He called it the Poetic Edda. Among the verses preserved inside was a cosmic knowledge contest called Vafthrûdnismál, the words of Vafthrûdnir, in which the god Odin, traveling under a false name, challenges an ancient giant to a contest of cosmic memory. The giant, Vafthrûdnir, recalls creation from the beginning. He recalls the primordial giant Ymir, the making of the world from Ymir's body, and the name of the one being who survived when that world first drowned. Bergelmir. In the Prose Edda, a companion compilation produced by the Christian Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson around 1220 CE, drawing on older source material, the flood is given its mechanism. When Odin and his brothers slew Ymir, the blood that poured from the primordial giant's body was so vast in quantity that it drowned every other frost giant on Earth. Every one. The world was unmade by the blood. Only Bergelmir and his wife escaped by climbing into a Luther. That is the Norse word. The etymology is what scholars have debated for decades. Rudolf Simek of the University of Vienna, in his Dictionary of Northern Mythology published in 1993, traces the root to a hollow object, a vessel, a box, a container sealed against what was outside it, whether it was specifically a boat, a coffin-shaped ark, or a trough hollowed from a log. The semantic range of Luther consistently points to a wooden hollow structure large enough for a person to occupy. The frost giant and his wife went inside. The world drowned. They survived. The structural elements are not vague, and they are not metaphorical in the text's own terms. A catastrophe so complete it constitutes the death of the entire world. A single man and his wife, a sealed wooden vessel, and when the catastrophe ends, the world is remade, rebuilt in the Norse account, from the very body of the giant whose blood created the flood. The post-deluge world is identical in its rebuilt architecture to the world that preceded it. But here's where the Norse tradition becomes more unsettling than a simple cultural coincidence. Snorri Sturluson was a 13th century Icelandic Christian. He wrote the Prose Edda in an Iceland that had formally converted to Christianity roughly 3 centuries before his birth. If the Bergelmir story were a Norse imitation of Genesis, a pagan tradition quietly shaped by the biblical flood narrative, then a Christian scholar transcribing and organizing that tradition would have had every incentive to push it toward a cleaner Genesis parallel. A righteous man, a divine warning, an ark built from measured timber, a rainbow of promise after. Snorri gives none of that. The flood is blood. The vessel is a Luther with a disputed meaning. The cause of the catastrophe is not divine punishment, but cosmological consequence. These details did not come from Genesis. They preserved something older, in a direction the Genesis tradition did not travel. The Codex Regius, the royal codex, the manuscript Bishop Sveinsson received in 1643, was repatriated from Copenhagen to Reykjavík in 1971, and is now held at the Árni Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies. It is displayed behind glass, a manuscript written on prepared calfskin in ink that has darkened over 7 centuries. The stanza naming Bergelmir and the Luther is on the 3rd leaf of the Vafthrûdnismál section. The word is still there. The debate about what it means continues. A survivor in a hollow vessel, a catastrophe that preceded the world as it now exists. The Norse preserved it in a poem old enough that no one can say with certainty where it came from. Number 9. The Greeks. In 1939, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos published a paper in the journal Antiquity titled The Volcanic Destruction of Minoan Crete. He had been excavating Bronze Age sites on the north coast of Crete and had found something interrupting: the archaeology. Beneath the floor of a Minoan building at the harbor site of Amnisos, he found displaced wall stones and beneath the disturbance, a layer of volcanic pumice. The pumice was theron, from the island of Santorini, ancient Thera, which had exploded catastrophically in the 2nd millennium BCE. Marinatos argued that the tsunamis and ashfall produced by the Theron eruption had ended Minoan civilization not gradually, but suddenly, in a series of events so violent that the geological signature was still readable in floor disturbance and pumice deposition nearly 4,000 years later. Later researchers estimated the tsunami waves from Thera at between 9 and 35 meters along the Cretan coastline. Whether the Theran catastrophe provided the source material for later Greek flood memory, or represents only one episode in a longer accumulated tradition of catastrophic inundation, what the literary record establishes is this. By the 5th century BCE, ancient Greek civilization had a fully developed, multiply-attested, detailed flood narrative that it treated as foundational historical fact. The survivor was Deucalion. His father Prometheus warned him that Zeus had decided to destroy humanity. Deucalion built a larnax, a sealed chest, the same word Greek writers used for coffins and for the box that drifted Perseus across the sea as an infant, and survived the flood with his wife Pyrrha. The flood lasted 9 days and 9 nights. The larnax came to rest on Mount Parnassus or on Mount Othrys in variant accounts. After the waters receded, Deucalion and Pyrrha performed sacrifice. They repopulated humanity by throwing stones over their shoulders, which became people. The sources are not obscure. Pindar wrote about Deucalion and Pyrrha in Olympian Ode 9, composed in 466 BCE, placing them on Parnassus as the founders of the post-flood human race. Hellanicus of Lesbos, writing in the 5th century BCE, composed an entire dedicated work about the event, a text he called the Deucalioniae, a complete monograph on the flood tradition. Apollodorus records the full narrative in his library at 1.7.2 with the 9-day duration, the larnax, and the mountain landing. The Roman poet Ovid gives the most elaborate version in the Metamorphoses, written around 8 CE, with the waters covering every mountain except Parnassus. 4 independent sources across 6 centuries of Greek literature. Each treats the event as history. What makes this particularly unsettling is not the parallels to Genesis, it's the timeline. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures which would have made the Genesis flood narrative available to Greek readers for the first time, was produced in Alexandria beginning in the 3rd century BCE. Pindar composed Olympian Ode 9 in 466 BCE. Hellanicus wrote his Deucalionia in the 5th century BCE. Both texts predate any Greek language version of the Genesis flood by at least 2 centuries. The Greek writers were not constructing a parallel to a tradition they had access to. They were recording their own flood tradition in a period before the mechanism of biblical borrowing could have operated. A sealed vessel, a single man and his wife, a period of flooding measured in days, a mountain summit as the landing point, a sacrifice after. All of it present in the Greek literary record, 2 centuries before the Hebrew flood narrative existed in a language Greek scholars could read. Pindar's Olympian Ode 9 is still in the canonical corpus of classical Greek literature. The fragments of Hellanicus's Deucalionia survive in quotations preserved by later authors. Apollodorus's library is still translated and assigned at universities in Athens, Oxford, and Chicago. The Greek tradition did not need Genesis to produce its flood narrative. It had its own. The larnax still floats through the text. The 9 days are still recorded. The mountain is still there. Number 8. The Persians. The Avesta, the sacred scriptural collection of Zoroastrianism, the religion of ancient Persia, survives today in a fraction of its original scope. The tradition holds that the complete compilation once encompassed 21 books, called Nasks. What survives is estimated at roughly 1/4 of that total. The destruction of the remaining 3/4 is attributed to a series of catastrophes beginning with the Macedonian invasion of the 4th century BCE and continuing through the Parthian period, when the priestly transmission of Avestan texts was interrupted and fragmented. The Sassanid Persian Empire, beginning in the 3rd century CE, undertook a reconstruction of what could be recovered, drawing on scattered oral tradition and surviving written copies. The collection that exists today, including the section called the Vendidad, or Vidyavdat, is the Sassanid reconstruction of texts whose origins are substantially older, likely reaching back to the 1st millennium BCE or earlier in oral form. James Darmesteter produced the standard English translation for the Sacred Books of the East series at Oxford in 1880, working from the oldest available manuscript copies. In Fargard II of the Vendidad, the 2nd chapter of the Zoroastrian Law Code, Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian faith, appears to a righteous king named Yima and delivers a warning. A great destruction is coming. Not a flood of water, but a great evil winter, a cosmic cold, a period of devastating frost sent by the destructive spirit Angra-Mainyu, during which the natural world would cease to function and every living thing on the surface of the earth would perish. The instruction is specific. Build a vara, an enclosure. Rectangular, a league in each dimension. Bring into the vara the seeds of every living thing. Men and women, paired the best and finest of each kind. Cattle and dogs and birds and fire. Bring the plants, the waters, the fires. Seal it. Maintain it. Wait for the cosmic destruction to pass. The Vendidad specifies what is excluded. The deformed, the faithless, the wicked. Only the finest specimens of each kind are permitted inside the vara. The good seed of every living creature is preserved within its walls, while the world outside becomes uninhabitable. The truly disturbing implication is not that the Persian tradition resembles Genesis, it's what the difference in the destruction agent actually suggests. The Norse account describes water, the blood of Ymir. The Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions describe water, rain, and the fountains of the deep. The Persian tradition describes cold, a catastrophic winter, a cosmic freeze that makes the surface world uninhabitable. And yet the structural architecture of the survival event is identical in every other respect. A righteous individual receives forewarning from the divine authority. He receives specific construction instructions for a preservation vessel or enclosure. He loads it with paired specimens of every living kind. He survives while the rest of the world is destroyed. A single pair of every species preserved by specific divine provision. This convergence is either a product of cultural borrowing so ancient it predates all 5 literary traditions, or it is the record of the same catastrophic event, remembered through different geographic and climatic experiences. The post-glacial period, the era following the last glacial maximum, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years before the Common Era, produced different catastrophic experiences in different parts of the ancient world simultaneously. In lower latitude river basins, rapidly melting ice sheets sent catastrophic meltwater floods through river systems. In higher latitudes and interior continental regions, the advance and retreat of glacial cold were the dominant experience. If the younger Dryas cold event, or the post-glacial climate disruption that followed it, was experienced as flood by the people of the Mesopotamian basin and as catastrophic winter by the people of the Iranian plateau, both memories might describe the same geological moment in different terms. The Vendidad has not been recovered in its original form. Significant portions of the 21 original Nasks remain unrecovered. What exists is a Sassanid reconstruction of a tradition older than its surviving written form can document. Yima's Vara, the enclosure that preserved the seed of every living thing through the world's destruction, is in the surviving fragment. The instruction to bring pairs of every kind is in the text. The parallel to the preservation command in Genesis chapter 6 does not require editorial commentary. The instruction is the same. The agent of destruction is what changed between the Zagros Mountains and the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. The memory of what needed to be saved did not change at all. Number 7. The Aztec. In 1790, workers laying cobblestones along a street in Mexico City struck something massive approximately 1.5 meters below the surface. Spain had destroyed the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in the period following 1521, building the new colonial capital directly on top of its ruins. What the workers' tools struck was a basalt disc roughly 3.6 meters in diameter, weighing approximately 24 metric tons. Spanish colonial authorities had buried it face down after the conquest, having recognized it as a devotional object associated with the religious traditions they were suppressing. The workers who dug it up did not know what they had found. The object is now displayed at the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, where it is known as the Aztec Calendar Stone, or the Sunstone. Carved onto its upper face is the complete cosmological diagram of Aztec time, the current age of the world at its center, surrounded by the 4 previous ages in the inner ring. The 4th previous age is identified by its glyph as Naui ATL, 4 water. Its destruction method is recorded alongside it in the iconographic system of the stone. The 4th sun was destroyed by flood. The Codex Chimalpopoca, a manuscript produced around 1558 to 1560 CE from Nahuatl language oral traditions, substantially older than that date, contains the Leyenda de los Soles, the legend of the 5 suns. The text provides the detailed account. The creators Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl, the paired forces of Aztec cosmology, decided to destroy the imperfect humans of the 4th age with water. 2 individuals were accepted, a man named Tada and a woman named Nene. The god told them to hollow out a cypress log, not to build a vessel from worked timber as in the Genesis account, but to hollow out an existing tree, to use the interior of something already living as the enclosure for their survival. They were given corn to sustain them inside the log. When the waters rose, they were sealed within it. The flood destroyed the fourth sun and every living thing in it. Tada and Nene survived. When the waters receded, they emerged and cooked fish. The smoke from their fire rose toward the heavens. The gods responded with anger, a punishment for the unauthorized act of cooking, for using divine fire without permission after the catastrophe. The narrative concludes with the creation of the fifth sun, the current world, produced after the flood had ended the fourth. Consider the implication. The Nahuatl-speaking civilization of central Mexico, whose calendar system, architectural tradition, and cosmological framework developed entirely in isolation from the ancient Near East, whose writing, religion, and urban planning bore no traceable connection to Mesopotamia or the Levant, preserved a flood survival narrative containing the following specific elements: a couple selected by divine authority for survival, a sealed wooden vessel constructed according to divine specification, the destruction of the remainder of humanity by water, and a divine interaction with the survivors after the flood, involving fire and the gods' response to it. The Codex Chimalpopoca was written down by Aztec scribes. Its traditions had already been formed before any European missionary could have introduced Genesis content. The Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica with their biblical text in 1519. The Aztec cosmological tradition describing the fourth sun's flood destruction predated them by centuries. The Aztec calendar stone is at the Museo Nacional de Antropología, on permanent display in the Mexica Hall, Room 7. The Naui Atliff glyph, for water, the flood that ended the fourth world, is carved into the basalt of the inner ring at the upper right quadrant of the face. It was buried face down for nearly 3 centuries. It is now face up. The flood that destroyed the fourth world before this one is still on it, in stone in a system of notation that has nothing to do with Genesis, and says exactly the same thing. Number 6. The Maya. In approximately 1701, a Spanish Dominican priest named Francisco Jimenez, stationed at the parish of Santo Tomás Chichicastenango, in the highlands of what is now Guatemala, obtained access to a manuscript that the local Quiché Maya population had been carefully preserving. He recognized that the text was written in the Quiché Maya language, a language with no genetic or structural relationship to any Old World language family, developed in complete isolation from the linguistic traditions of the ancient Near East, the Mediterranean or the Indo-European world. Jimenez was sufficiently fluent in Quiché to read it. He made a copy, the original Quiché text, reproduced on the left-hand pages of his notebook, with a Spanish translation on the right. The original Quiché manuscript he copied from, believed to have been written around 1550 CE by Quiché Maya scribes, preserving oral traditions of unknown but substantial antiquity, subsequently disappeared. Francisco Jimenez's copy became the only surviving complete version of the Popol Vuh. That copy is now at the Newberry Library in Chicago, where it has been held since its acquisition by the collector Edward E. Ayer. Adrian Recinos produced the standard Spanish scholarly edition in 1950. Monroe Edmondson at Tulane University produced the standard English critical edition in 1971. The Popol Vuh is the Quiché Maya account of creation and the multiple attempts to make humanity. The first creation failed. The second failed. The third, the wooden people, fashioned from the wood of the coral tree and the pith of the bulrush, was destroyed. The method of their destruction was a great flood. The text of the Popol Vuh describes what happened with a specificity that reads less like cosmological allegory and more like accumulated catastrophic memory. The sky was darkened. A great rain came, described in the text as a rain of resin falling from the sky before the waters rose. Then the waters rose. The animals turned against the wooden people, attacking them for the mistreatment they had received. The dogs spoke and charged them with indignity. The grinding stones rose up. The cooking vessels revolted. The wooden people fled upward, trying to climb onto the rooftops of their houses, trying to reach the branches of trees, and the rooftops crumbled under them, and the trees shook them loose. The text states it plainly. There was no place for them. The waters covered them. Not one of the wooden people survived. Those that remained in the forests became the monkeys, a transformed remnant reduced to something less than humanity. And the flood took everything else. The Maya account is structurally distinct from the Norse, Greek, and Persian traditions in a significant respect. It does not give a survivor. The wooden people are not preserved. The flood is total, and the remnant is not a righteous individual in a vessel, but a degraded species in the trees. The survival structure shifts to the creators themselves, who then produced the fourth and successful attempt at humanity from maize. But the core event, a complete humanity-ending flood, preceded by divine decision about an imperfect creation, is present and specific. But here's where the isolation of the Maya tradition becomes impossible to explain away through the standard mechanism. The wooden people tradition in the Popol Vuh cannot have been shaped by Genesis because the specific details of the Quiche account do not match Genesis. The flood in Genesis has a righteous survivor and a divine preservation promise. The Maya flood has neither. It is total destruction with no ark, no covenant, no rainbow after. If the Maya had borrowed the Genesis flood narrative through missionary contact, the Genesis version would have produced a parallel that matched its own structure. It did not. What the Popol Vuh preserves is a flood tradition with its own distinct internal logic, a different kind of catastrophic inundation memory, developed in cultural isolation, which arrives at the same foundational conclusion as the traditions of three other continents. A previous humanity was destroyed by water, and what exists now is what came after. The Quiche, Maya language, belongs to the Mayan language family, which emerged and developed in complete geographic and linguistic isolation from Old World traditions. The oral traditions preserved in the Popol Vuh were formed before the 1550 C manuscript, and substantially before 1519. The manuscript Jimenez copied from was already circulating in the Maya community as a preserved tradition when he arrived. No mechanism of biblical borrowing was operational in the Guatemalan highlands. Before the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the traditions the Popol Vuh records arrived there through a different channel entirely. Jimenez's copy is in Chicago. The account of the wooden people, the rain, the rising water, and the futility of every escape attempt is on pages 4 and 5 of the Quiche text. The trees shook the wooden people loose. The rooftops collapsed under them. The water rose until there was nothing to climb to. That version of humanity is gone. The Maya remembered that it happened. They recorded it in a language that developed on the other side of the world from every other civilization that remembered the same event. Number 5. The Chinese. In 2016, a team of geologists and archaeologists led by Qinglong Wu at Peking University published a paper in Science that resolved a debate that had occupied Chinese historical scholarship for decades. The paper documented the physical evidence for a catastrophic flood event on the Yellow River, specifically in the Jishi Gorge section of the Upper River in present-day Qinghai province, that occurred around 1920 BCE. The evidence was a landslide dam. A section of the canyon wall had collapsed into the gorge, impounding the river behind a natural barrier estimated at 200 to 250 meters in height. When that dam failed, Wu's team demonstrated. It failed catastrophically. Hydraulic modeling produced estimated flood peak discharges of approximately 38 to 40 meters above the normal channel. Flood flows approximately 500 times the Yellow River's present mean discharge. Downstream, at the Bronze Age site of Lajia in Qinghai, the team found children's skeletal remains in the positions of those who had died suddenly without warning, in structures buried by flows of earthquake-triggered sediment that preceded the flood. The radiocarbon dates from the Lajia victims clustered around the same period as the landslide dam failure upstream. The event was datable. It happened. The Shang Shu, the Book of Documents, one of the 5 classics of Confucianism, attributed in its oldest surviving portions to the era of the legendary Emperor Yao, traditionally placed around 2100 BCE, opens with a flood. Not a flood as mythology, not a flood as cosmological allegory, a flood as a governing crisis. The text records that the waters were vast, surrounding hills and inundating mountains, raging with destructive power across the known world. Yao appointed a man named Gun to control the waters. Gun worked for 9 years by attempting to dam them, and failed. He was executed for his failure. Gun's son Yu then took on the task. Yu worked for 13 years. He dredged channels rather than building dams, working with the water's direction rather than against it, cutting pathways for the water to reach the sea. He succeeded. The floodwaters withdrew into the great rivers. Yu was declared the founder of the Xia dynasty, the first hereditary ruling family in the Chinese historical tradition. What makes the Chinese account paradigm threatening is not the narrative. It's what Wu's team found in 2016. The Shang Shu places Yao's flood crisis at approximately 2100 BCE in the traditional chronology. Wu et al.'s evidence identifies a catastrophic Yellow River flood at approximately 1920 BCE, within the range of traditional dating for the Yao Shun Yu period, depending on which chronological system is applied. The paper does not prove that the Shangshu's flood is Wu's flood. What it proves is that a catastrophic Yellow River flood, of the scale described in the Shangshu where hills are surrounded and mountains are inundated, physically occurred at a date consistent with the period the Chinese historical tradition places it. The flood in the Shangshu was not an invention inserted into the political record. It corresponds to a datable geological event. Genesis 7 records a flood that covered mountains. The Shangshu records a flood that surrounded hills and inundated mountains. The Chinese text is not borrowing from the Hebrew tradition. The Shangshu was formed in a civilization that had no contact with the ancient Near East, in a language unrelated to any Semitic tongue, in a political and administrative tradition that arose independently of Mesopotamia. But the description is the same: water that reached the high ground, a crisis severe enough that a single man's response to it became the foundational act of a dynasty. The Shangshu was among the texts targeted by the Qin Emperor Shi Huang's book-burning decree of 213 BCE, which ordered the destruction of texts associated with Confucian scholarship. The version of the Shangshu that survives was reconstructed from portions memorized by scholars who had hidden from the imperial decree. One copy was reportedly discovered sealed inside the walls of Confucius's former house, written in an archaic script. The flood tradition that opens the text, the governing crisis that produced the Xia dynasty, survived the burning. The 2016 paper in Science found it again, in the sediment of Jishi Gorge, a chaotic disruption in the otherwise stratified river deposit, with calibrated radiocarbon dates clustering around 1920 BCE, marks the moment the dam failed, and the Yellow River produced the flood the Shangshu had preserved for 4,000 years. The sediment layer is still in the gorge. The flood pulse is still in the geological record. The Chinese remembered an event that left marks in the ground. The marks were there when Wu's team looked for them. Number 4. The Hindus, sometime between 800 and 600 BCE, in the same century that Isaiah wrote his oracles in Jerusalem, that Homer's epics were being codified in the Greek tradition, and that the Neo-Babylonian Empire was reaching the height of its power. A Sanskrit priestly text called the Satapatha Brahmana was compiled and standardized by the Vedic religious establishment of the Indian subcontinent. The Satapatha Brahmana is among the oldest surviving prose compositions in the Sanskrit literary record. It is a massive work, running to 14 books covering the full range of Vedic ritual procedure. It was not written for a general audience. It was produced by a priestly class for the specialized purpose of governing ritual performance. And in its first major section, the first Khanda, the 8th Brahmana, the first Adhyaya, it preserves a flood narrative that shares no genetic or textual relationship with any tradition in the ancient Near East. A man named Manu, whose name connects him linguistically to the root for humanity itself in the Sanskrit tradition, the same root that produces the Latin homo and the English man, was performing his morning ablutions when a small fish appeared in the water of his washing vessel. The fish addressed him. It told him that if he would raise it and protect it from the larger fish that would devour it, it would save him from a coming catastrophe. Manu raised the fish. He transferred it from the vessel to a jar, then to a larger pit when it outgrew the jar, then to a river, then to the ocean, as the fish grew beyond what any container could hold. When the fish had reached its full size and was deposited in the sea, it spoke again. In a specific year, a great flood would come. Manu was to build a ship. When the floodwaters rose, the fish came, and Manu tied his ship to the fish's horn with a rope. The fish towed the ship northward through the rising waters to the mountain called Himavat. The Himavat, the Himalayan range, the highest concentration of mountain summits on the surface of the earth, including the planet's highest peak. The Satapatha Brahmana does not specify a local mountain, a nearby prominence, a modest rise. It specifies the northern mountain range, the range that forms the geographic crown of the Indian subcontinent, and contains every summit above 7,000 meters on Earth. Manu's ship was towed there, tied to the fish's horn as the waters rose. He tied the ship to the peak of the Himavat and waited for the flood to subside. As the waters receded, the ship was left behind on the slopes, which is why, the text notes, the peak is called the Descent of Manu, Manuravana. The Mahabharata, the epic composition that reached something close to its present form between 400 BCE and 400 CE, preserves an expanded version of the flood narrative in the Shanti Parva, the Book of Peace, at approximately chapter 187. The fish in the Mahabharata version is explicitly identified as Brahma, the creator deity, or in other manuscripts as an avatar of Vishnu, the preserver of the cosmos. The fish grows from Manu's palm-sized vessel to fill the ocean, The warning is the same, the ship is the same, the fish is the same. But here's where the Satapatha Brahmana account becomes difficult to categorize. The text was produced on the Indian subcontinent by a priestly tradition that had no documented contact with the scribal establishments of ancient Israel or Babylon. The Vedic tradition from which the Satapatha Brahmana emerged developed independently of the Semitic literary world. The fish as the vehicle of divine preservation has no parallel in Genesis or in any Mesopotamian flood account. The growth sequence, from palm size to ocean filling, has no parallel in any other surviving flood tradition. The landing on the northern mountain range, specified by name, is unique to this tradition. And yet the core structure, a righteous individual warned by divine authority, a vessel constructed for survival, a catastrophic flood that kills everything outside the vessel, a landing on elevated ground, a sacrifice after, is identical to the tradition that the Hebrew text and the Akkadian texts preserve. Julius Egeling produced the English translation of the Satapatha Brahmana for the Sacred Books of the East series between 1882 and 1900, in 5 volumes published by Oxford University Press. The translation remains the standard scholarly reference. The flood narrative is in Volume 1, Part 1, Book 1, Brahmana 8. The instruction that the fish gave to Manu, build a ship, tie it to the horn, go north, is specific in its geographic direction. The author who placed Manu's landing on the Himavat wrote at a time when there was no scientific framework for measuring mountain elevation, no systematic cartographic record of the Asian continent, and no reason drawn from the flood narrative's own logic to specify the highest mountains on Earth as the endpoint rather than any convenient local summit. The text specified the Himavat. The tradition that produced it described a flood for which the northern mountain range, the roof of the world, was the nearest ground high enough to land on. Number 3. The Babylonians. In 1965, archaeologists excavating at Tel Abu Haba in central Iraq, the site of ancient Sippar, one of the 5 antediluvian cities named in the Sumerian king list, recovered a cache of cuneiform tablets sealed inside a ceramic jar beneath the floor of a temple library. Among the recovered material was a version of the Atra-ḥasīs epic. The tablets were damaged. They were transferred to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. 4 years later, in 1969, W. G. Lambert of the University of Birmingham and A. R. Millard of the University of Liverpool published the definitive critical edition of the text, Atra-ḥasīs, The Babylonian Story of the Flood, released by Oxford University Press. The edition assembled the old Babylonian tablets from Sippar, Nippur, and the British Museum's collection into the most complete version of the Atra-ḥasīs account available to scholarship. The oldest tablets in the compilation dated to approximately 1700 BCE, predating the scholarly consensus dates for the composition of Genesis's flood narrative by more than 1,000 years. The Atra-ḥasīs account does not begin with a man. It begins with a labor crisis among the gods. The lesser divine beings, the EGG, are performing exhausting cosmological work under the direction of the greater gods, the Anuna. They rebel. The solution the divine council produces is humanity, living beings fashioned from clay mixed with the blood of a slain minor deity, created to perform the labor the EGG refused. Humanity performs its function. Humanity multiplies, and multiplies, and multiplies. The noise of the expanding human population disturbs the god Enlil, the noise specifically the sound of their existence, to a degree he describes as intolerable. He brings the matter before the divine council. They vote to eliminate humanity. The first attempt is plague, then drought, then flood. The god Enki had helped design humanity. He cannot openly oppose the divine council's decision. He finds a procedural mechanism. He speaks to a reed wall. The Atra-ḥasīs text specifies this. Enki addresses the wall of a reed house directly, technically not speaking to the man. Atra-ḥasīs, be exceedingly wise, who lives on the other side of it. The wall hears the warning. Atra-ḥasīs hears what the wall hears. The god maintains his deniability before the council while the man receives the instruction, tear down your house, build a boat. Load it with animals, with your family, with the seed of every living thing. The flood will come for 7 days and 7 nights. It comes. The text records that even the gods who voted for the flood had not fully modeled the consequences. Their temples were underwater. Their food offerings had ceased. The human support structure the divine establishment depended on had been destroyed along with the humans. The text describes the gods crouching against the walls of the highest heaven, pressed like dogs against the architecture, frightened by the scope of what they had approved. When Atra-ḥasīs sacrifices after the flood, the gods gather at the smell of the offering like flies. The most unsettling aspect of the Atra-ḥasīs account is not the structural parallel to Genesis, it's the reed wall. The god who warned the man could not warn the man openly. He had to speak to the wall and let the man hear through it. He preserved deniability by technically complying with the council's decision, never having warned the human directly, never having instructed him to survive. The Genesis account gives no such procedural mechanism. The god of Genesis warns Noah directly, with no council to navigate, no vote to honor, no deniability to maintain. The Atra-ḥasīs version is older. The Atra-ḥasīs version is the one in which the divine warning arrives through an architectural workaround, through the wall of a reed house, and a whisper the god could later claim was addressed to the building rather than the man. Lambert and Millard's critical edition is still the standard scholarly reference for the Atra-ḥasīs text. The Sippar tablets are in the Iraq Museum. The British Museum's collection of Atra-ḥasīs fragments is in the Mesopotamia galleries. No institutional body has formally proposed a comprehensive excavation program at the remaining unstudied Sippar site locations to determine whether additional tablets from the Atra-ḥasīs tradition remain in the ground. The reed wall is still in the cuneiform on the tablets Lambert and Millard assembled. Enki spoke to the wall. The wall let the warning through. The man on the other side built a boat and survived. Number 2. The Sumerians. In 1922, an antiquities dealer operating at the site of ancient Kish in central Iraq sold a 4-sided inscribed clay prism to a British collector named Herbert Weld-Blundell. Weld-Blundell donated it to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, where cuneiformists recognized it within months as one of the most consequential administrative documents ever recovered from the ancient Near East. The Weld-Blundell prism, now dated to approximately 2100 to 2000 BCE, making it among the oldest surviving royal administrative texts, contains the Sumerian king list, a sequential record of political succession across the full span of Sumerian civilization. The text records which city held kingship, which king held it, and how long each king reigned. It is the kind of document that political administrators produce to track legitimate succession of power. It is not a theological text. It is not a mythological composition. It is the nearest equivalent the ancient world possessed to a state historical record. The king list does not begin with the dynasties familiar to modern scholarship. It begins before recorded time, with 8 kings whose names appear in no other surviving source, and whose reign lengths are recorded in numbers that no historian has been able to explain. Alulim of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, Alangar for 36,000 years, Enmen-Lu-Ana for 43,200 years, Dumuzid for 36,000 years, Ubar-Tutu of Shuruppak for 18,600 years. 5 cities, 8 antediluvian kings, reign lengths measured in units that cannot be reconciled with human biology. Then the text records a specific event, a specific administrative transition, the flood. And after the flood, when kingship descended from heaven again, the kingship was in Kish. After the flood, the reign lengths change. The first king of the post-Diluvian dynasty of Kish reigns for 1,200 years, then 900, then 840, then 720, then 600. Then the figures drop to hundreds, then to decades, then to spans recognizable as human lifetimes. Something changed at the flood. Before it, rulers measured time in geological spans. After it, they began to age and die. Genesis chapter 5 records the antediluvian patriarchs: Adam at 930 years, Seth at 912, Enoch at 365, Methuselah at 969. After the flood, in chapter 11, the lifespans compress. Arphaxad at 438, Shelah at 433, Nahor at 148. The same pattern. Pre-flood figures with lifespans that challenge biological possibility, followed by the flood as a chronological divide, followed by progressively shorter lifespans in the generations after. The Sumerian administrative record and the Hebrew genealogical record use the same structure. The flood as the hinge between 2 different regimes of human duration, without any mechanism of borrowing that can account for the parallel. Because the Sumerian king list predates the scholarly consensus dates for the Genesis composition by more than a millennium, the Eridu Genesis, a Sumerian tablet held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology under the catalog designation CBS 10673, first translated by Arno Pobel of the Oriental Institute in 1914, provides the surviving narrative portion of the Sumerian flood account. The tablet is damaged. Significant sections are missing. What remains describes a time before cities, before priesthood, before established civilization. A divine assembly, a god's decision, a man named Zayusudra, warned by a deity who speaks through a wall, a wooden vessel, 7 days and 7 nights of catastrophic flood, the sun god Utu breaking through the clouds at the end, Zayusudra prostrating himself before the light, eternal life given to the survivor, who is placed in the land of Dilmun. The truly disturbing implication of the Sumerian material is not that a flood narrative exists. It's where the scribes put it. The Sumerian king list is an administrative document. Its purpose was to track the legitimate succession of political power, the kind of record that gives a ruling dynasty its authority by placing it in an unbroken chain of predecessors. This document, produced to serve the political needs of the Sumerian state, placed the flood between the antediluvian dynasties of Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak on one side and the post-diluvian dynasty of Kish on the other. Not in a separate mythological appendix, not in a theological commentary, in the middle of the succession records between 2 periods of political history as the event that ended one and began the other. The Weld-Blundell prism is on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The gap in the cuneiform, the place where the antediluvian kings end and the flood is recorded and the Kish dynasty begins, is on the 3rd column of the prism's face. The scribes who kept the Sumerian political record treated the flood not as a story, but as a date. Before it, one kind of history. After it, another kind entirely. The prism sits in Oxford with the division still on it. Number 1. The Gilgamesh tablets. On the morning of December 3rd, 1872, a self-taught cuneiformist named George Smith sat in the Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities workroom of the British Museum and lifted a clay tablet that had been excavated from the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal at ancient Nineveh, modern Mosul, by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The tablets had arrived in London in crates, dirty and fragmented, catalogued in bulk. Smith had been working through the collection for years, cleaning and reading what other scholars had not had time to examine. The tablet he lifted that morning was the 11th in a larger epic composition, a story centered on a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who had traveled to the ends of the earth in search of immortality, and found, at the mouth of the rivers, an old man who should not exist, a man who had survived the flood that had once destroyed every living thing in the world, and who had been given eternal life by the gods as a reward for that survival. Smith read the tablet. He read it again. He presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology later that same day, December 3rd, 1872, in the presence of William Ewart Gladstone, then serving as Prime Minister of England, who had a long-standing and serious interest in biblical scholarship. The response was immediate. The London Daily Telegraph provided funding, a reported sum of £1,000, for Smith to travel to Nineveh himself and search for the missing portions of the text. He sailed in January 1873. Within days of beginning excavations at the Nineveh site, Smith found additional fragments. He died in Aleppo on August 19, 1876, aged 36, during his 3rd expedition to the region, searching for more. What Smith had read in the British Museum workroom was the following. The god Ea, elsewhere named Enki, the divine patron of wisdom and water, appeared to a man named Utnapishtim and warned him of a coming destruction. The great gods had decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Ea's instruction: tear down your house, build a boat, abandon your possessions, take aboard the seed of all living things, your family, the craftsmen of the city, cattle and wild animals. The boat was to be built to specific proportions, as tall as it was wide, with 7 decks and 9 divisions. It was sealed with pitch. The flood came, 6 days and 7 nights, a south wind and a storm. The text describes what the gods saw when they looked down from the highest heaven. They pressed against the walls of the sky like dogs, frightened by the scale of what they had set in motion. On the 7th day, the flood stilled. Utnapishtim opened a hatch. He looked out over silence. He sat down and wept. Every human being had been returned to clay. His vessel had come to rest on Mount Nisir, a mountain in what is now northern Iraq or Kurdistan, the specific identification still disputed among scholars. He waited 7 days. Then he sent out a bird, a dove. The dove flew out and returned. No resting place. He waited and sent out a swallow. The swallow flew out and returned, no resting place. Then he sent out a raven. The raven flew out. The text records what it did. The raven saw that the waters were receding. It ate, it swam in the shallows, it circled, it did not return. And Utnapishtim knew the earth had emerged from the water. Genesis chapter 8 verse 6 records the following. Noah opened the window of the ark. He sent out a raven. The raven flew back and forth until the waters dried from the earth. Then Noah sent out a dove. The dove returned, no resting place. He waited 7 days and sent the dove out again. The dove returned with an olive leaf in its mouth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again. It did not return. Noah knew the waters had receded. 2 texts, one written in Akkadian cuneiform on clay tablets by a Babylonian scribal tradition, one preserved in the Hebrew canonical scriptures. Both describe a righteous man, a vessel built at divine instruction, a catastrophic flood, a landing on a mountain, birds released to test the receding waters. And in both texts, across 2 languages and 2 manuscript traditions, the bird that does not return, the bird whose non-return tells the survivor that the earth is inhabitable, is the raven, not a generic bird. The raven, a corvid, a scavenger, a species that, once it locates a food source, will work that source rather than return to a point of origin. The specific behavioral characteristic of the raven that makes it a reliable indicator of dry land, it will not come back if there is something to eat, is embedded in both texts. Both accounts independently observed the same behavior. Both independently used that behavior as the signal that the flood had ended. But here's where the standard scholarly resolution to this parallel fails to account for the full scope of what the evidence shows. The most common explanation offered for the raven and dove correspondence between Gilgamesh and Genesis is borrowing. The Hebrew scribes encountered the Babylonian flood narrative during the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BCE and incorporated elements of it into the Genesis account. This explanation requires taking the following at face value: that the Hebrews borrowed a story that was, in its old Babylonian written form, already 1,000 years old. That they borrowed a story treated as historical record in both the Sumerian administrative documents and the Babylonian literary tradition. That they borrowed it from a civilization whose flood tradition, as demonstrated by the Atra-ḥasīs tablets, the Eridu Genesis, and the Sumerian king list, treated the flood not as mythology but as the administrative boundary between 2 historical periods. And that the same story, with the same essential survival structure, was simultaneously being preserved in completely independent forms by the Vedic priests of India, by the Norse oral tradition of Scandinavia, and by the Greek historians of the 5th century BCE. The raven that flew from Utnapishtim's hand is the detonation point because it collapses the borrowing explanation at its foundations. The Mayan wooden people drowned with no raven. The Hindu Manu's fish towed him to the Himalayas with no bird to test the waters. The Norse Bergelmir climbed into his luther with no raven. Only the Mesopotamian and Hebrew traditions specify the raven in that same narrative position, doing the same thing with the same result. And the Mesopotamian tradition that specifies it is demonstrably older, in its written form, than the Hebrew tradition by more than a millennium. If these are 2 independent accounts borrowing from a common tradition rather than one borrowing from the other, then what they share, the righteous survivor, the vessel, the birds, the raven specifically, was already present in the source tradition both inherited, a source tradition old enough to predate both the Akkadian literary transmission and the Hebrew scribal tradition. A source tradition that was describing an actual event, because the only context in which a raven's behavior serves as a reliable indicator of dry land is if someone was actually on a boat, watching a raven fly away from it, and noting that the raven did not come back. Someone was on the water. Someone watched the raven go. Someone noted that a raven that finds dry land will eat and swim and circle and not return to the vessel that released it. And that specific observation, carried through a tradition old enough to have divided before the Akkadian and Hebrew scribal schools, diverged, arrived in both texts, in both languages, with both manuscripts giving the same bird, performing the same act, with the same meaning. Tablet Excella of the Epic of Gilgamesh is at the British Museum, catalogued as Tablet K3375 and associated fragments. It is displayed in the Mesopotamia galleries on the ground floor. The raven passage is in approximately lines 151 to 154 of the standard cuneiform transliteration. The waters were receding. The bird saw the dry ground. It ate. It did not come back. That observation is in the Babylonian clay. It is in the Hebrew text. It is in two traditions that emerged from a common source old enough that no surviving document records it. A tradition older than Akkadian cuneiform, older than the Hebrew scribal establishment, old enough to have been formed at a time when someone was actually present at the event, both traditions remembered. George Smith is buried in Aleppo. The tablets he spent his career reading are behind glass in London. The raven he found in the cuneiform on the morning of December 3, 1872, is still there, doing exactly what both texts said it did, in a position that the standard explanation for how the two traditions relate to each other has never fully resolved. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.